Hi, everybody. Hello and welcome to Clear Seas' webinar on Canadians' attitudes towards marine shipping. My name is Paul Blomerus. I'm the Executive Director here at Clear Seas. Clear Seas is a Canadian nonprofit organization that provides independent, fact-based information to people like you who are looking to make better and more informed decisions on marine shipping issues. Clear Seas is a national organization, and I'm joining you from our Vancouver head office that is situated on the traditional ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm joined here today by Shachi Kurl and John Rowe from the Angus Reid Institute. And we're here today to discuss the results of our most recent public opinion poll. So Clear Seas has been working with the Angus Reid Institute for a number of years now, and we've been conducting these polls every 2 years, going back to 2016. And so the most recent one has just been published, and it's available on our website. It's published in both French and English. This webinar is going to be in English and will be recorded, and the recording will be made available for others to watch at a later date. There is going to be some time for questions, and we're going to probably conduct those through the question on answer, or sorry, through the chat function within Teams. Within Zoom. And feel free to ask those questions at any time, and we'll pick them up at the end. So without further ado, let's turn to the report. And I wanted to start the discussion with the headline, which we put on the report, saying that zero carbon shipping, majority of Canadians are willing to pay extra to offset emissions, which I think is quite, I hope you'll agree, is quite a striking conclusion. I think, I'm often involved in discussions, as I know many of you are, on decarbonization and the investment that's going to be required to pay for decarbonization. And we all know that global shipping is a particularly large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions globally, and the investments required to decarbonize are significant. And there's always a discussion about, well, how are we going to pay for this? Traditionally, we're always taught that the customer is not willing to pay and that we'll have to find a way to make it cheaper. So these conclusions are kind of interesting. That suggests that, and as we look at the details of the data, so this is the charts that are produced from the data that show in the blue, the dark blue, light blue, and the two colors of gray are the 64% of Canadians that are willing to pay something more to offset the shipping emissions for goods that are shipped to them from overseas. And then that's the left-hand column. And then you can see the breakdown by male and female, and then by age categories, and with the N representing the sample size within that. So I want to start off our discussion by asking Shachi maybe to dig into a little bit what she thinks is going on there. Should we be optimistic about this? What are we learning about what Canadians think about offsetting emissions from shipping?
Okay. Hi, Paul. Thank you. And just to introduce myself to those of you on the webinar and to introduce my colleague, John Rowe. I'm the president of the Angus Reid Institute. We actually just celebrated our 10th birthday, our 10th anniversary a couple days ago on October 1st. You've heard the name Angus Reid around polling for probably the better part of 40 years, probably longer than some of you on this call have been around. But at the same time, the Institute, which operates as an independent, not-for-profit organization, we don't take private sector clients. We don't do polls for hire. We don't work with political parties, and we have independence of voice around the research that we do. That's been an entity for, gosh, a whole decade now. As I mentioned, I'm the president, and John is one of our research directors. He worked very closely with this report and these data, but Paul and so I'll invite him to add anything more that he wants to as I speak to some of these results. But Paul, to answer your question, the most striking thing of these data are the large numbers of young people between the ages of 18 and 34, nearly 20% of men between 18 to 34 years of age, and nearly 30% of young women who say that they'd be willing to pay more. So that does certainly track with a lot of what we're seeing in terms of who is prioritizing climate action, and working towards and interested in solutions such as net zero shipping. Now, take all of that with a little caveat or the tiniest grain of salt, in that we know two things for sure. Young people are often among the most enthusiastic about these types of questions or solutions, in that, from a paying of income tax perspective, or a what comes out of my actual household wallet perspective, it's often easier. Although the yes may be predicated in strong belief towards climate action, we know, for example, that those 35 to 54-year-olds, once they are raising kids and paying a mortgage and trying to get through life and pay for the groceries and pay for gas, life gets a little pointier, and they're much more into the trade-offs. And you see that with the falling off of support. The other aspect is people do tend to become more small c fiscally conservative as they age. So the key here is to actually track that young cohort and see if they are as enthusiastic in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. And I can tell you, because we have been doing this for 10 years now, I can see the way that that millennials who were in that age cohort back in 2014, in terms of paying for consumer carbon pricing, or being anti-pipeline, or a lot of those things, I can already see, based on the vast amount of polling that we do at the Institute, not just this landmark study, really are among those who are now starting to push back on the things that they were professing a significant amount of support for even a decade ago.
That's great. Thanks for those insights, Shachi. So, little cautious, but nevertheless cause to be optimistic for the future, and opportunities for decarbonization. I want to turn now to the sort of the overall topic of our survey, which I guess is Canadians' perspectives towards marine shipping. Now, we know how critical shipping is to the economy and to trade, and also, I guess, how it impacts people's lives, particularly in coastal communities, and in Indigenous communities all across the land. So we've been working on this the Shipping Confidence Index, and I think this gives us some really interesting insights, especially when we look at some of the breakdowns of this data. So, well, what's been done here is to divide the population into using the responses from the survey to see who are the shipping supporters who are broadly favorable towards marine shipping generally, and the kind of the measures that are in place to make it more safer and more sustainable. Then in the middle, in the gray, are the maritime moderates, who probably are still generally supportive but have some caution and some concern. And then the cautious critics are probably less favorable and probably skeptical about the environmental protection measures that the shipping industry is putting into place. And you can see that those groups are pretty well fixed over time. So you look at, since we've been doing this since 2020, some small changes, but by and large, generally, if you look at the overall population, I think that you'd agree that that's not moving tremendously much. But I think what's interesting is what you see, the kind of, again, looking at the demographic breakdown. And Shachi, I'm going to bring you in again to say, what do you think is happening here again? So when you look at the breakdown again between men and women, and in the age groups, there's almost the inverse of what we saw on the carbon pricing question. Maybe you can help us understand what's happening here.
Again, talking in generalities, Paul, and drawing on the years of polling that our organizations have done together, and then also just the broader the broader perceptions. So sometimes what we have to do when we're analyzing these data is sort of take what we know empirically, what we're seeing out there, and then also layer that onto what we're seeing in terms of the data. Shipping, has in broad brushstrokes. I understand it from a supply chain perspective and from a how do we get stuff that we can buy from other parts of the world that are not manufactured in Canada perspective, how important and integral shipping is to our economy, to consumers, etc. But when we think about things like oil spills, when we think about labor practices or perceived labor practices on board ships, when we think about the way ships are junked in certain parts of the world, it is not exactly an industry that, even at the best of times, has enjoyed a sterling reputation. And I mean, if you were to net out, say, the last 8 years of whatever Boeing's been through, the aerospace industry, by contrast, I think has had much more of a romantic or glorious or a perceived a perceived perception of safety, for example, or sort of being an industry that is less harmful. So look at that in terms of where young people are. Again, you see those cautious critics. They're more likely to be drawing on what they think they know about or what they perceive about the industry, and perhaps less thinking about the impacts around the Canadian economy, access to the iPhones that they're purchasing, or the clothes that they're purchasing, or the other items and devices and technology that we need shipping for. So from that perspective, again, it's a little bit of the life, and I don't mean to be dismissive of young people, but at all, but it is a little bit of that life experience aspect of things.
No, that's helpful. I guess the burden is then on us as an organization and as an industry to get out there and tell the story and raise the profile of what's happening and help to communicate. I want to bring John into the discussion a bit, because I think there's some other interesting insights if we look at this breakdown by region now. So the same categories of cautious critics, maritime moderates, and shipping supporters, but by region. So you can see from west to east by province, and then the Atlantic provinces or Atlantic Canada on the right. And so you can see, and this is kind of interesting, so you can see that in Alberta and Saskatchewan, probably where respondents recognize the importance of international trade for agricultural products and petroleum products, they are probably more supportive of shipping and fewer cautious critics there. In Atlantic Canada, I think also a significant connection to the maritime way of life and to shipping and to the ocean generally. And so there's probably more shipping supporters there. And then we've seen in previous surveys, I guess, the fact that in Quebec, in particular, there's a large number of cautious critics, probably because of environmental consciousness. And from what we've seen, a bit of a disconnect of Quebecers with the maritime industry and in general. But John, I wanted to get your perspective on what's happening in BC. So when we look at the data from last year, I think from 2 years ago, British Columbia was up at around 30% cautious critics, so similar to Quebec or Ontario. And now in this survey, we've seen that cautious critics decrease down to 20%, and I think some of the shipping support is going up. Maybe you can comment on what you see happening there and what the data is telling us.
Yeah, so I went back and kind of looked at some of the answers to other questions that kind of build into this index, and to see kind of where those opinions are shifting in BC, because it is kind of a notable change there, specifically because, like previously there was a lot more cautious critics there, despite being BC kind of being a coastal province, which has a lot of ties to the shipping industry. And what I found was that there's kind of a growing sense in BC that shipping is very important to the province's economy. That sense has kind of grown over the last kind of 2 cycles of this survey. and as well to their own day-to-day life. That's kind of grown over the last couple cycles of this survey. There's also been a bit of a growth as well in confidence in the shipping and regulations in BC. So that probably plays a factor in kind of perspectives of the industry. There's people there that believe that the industry, that there's more confidence kind of in what rules and regulations govern it. And I think as well, what we're seeing kind of in other data is that there's kind of been this shift in BC from a concern about with the environment, which was always kind of a top issue in the province. And now kind of economic issues are kind of becoming more prominent there. In recent data, we've been doing a lot of polling on the BC election, and the environment as a top issue is seventh now, behind things like public safety, things like the cost of living, things like healthcare. And typically we would see that in kind of the top three. So I think all those kind of factors come together and see this kind of shifting perspectives on BC on the shipping industry.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it affects a good transition to the next thing I was hoping to look at, which is the issues that are top of mind when people think about marine shipping in Canadian waters. So here, I think we've shown the data that shows the number of times or the percentage of times that respondents highlighted that issue as something that comes to mind when they think about it. And so you can see, obviously, at number 1 and number 4, the potential spill of oil or fuel from ships or oil tankers. I think we've seen the concerns about a rising concern about the dumping of waste or garbage from ships and maybe water pollution and discharges. I know that the marine life and endangered species, the one that's number 3, encounters and strikes and disturbances, that started to increase, I think, over the last 3 or 4 cycles. Probably because of public's awareness of the impact or the potential impact of shipping on particularly some of the large mammals. And so, yeah, I wondered whether either you, John, or Shachi, you had some perspectives on what you think's driving that. Looking at, I mean, it's true that greenhouse gas emissions are way down there on this list, and maybe issues that are more closer to home are rising up. What can you see from this?
I think what struck me with these data is, if we had asked 10 years ago around the issues of human trafficking, people smuggling, smuggling of drugs and contraband, when we are connecting the dots between what's happening at our coastal ports and things like the toxic drug crisis that people are experiencing, here in British Columbia or other parts of the country. And just because the drugs are offloaded here doesn't mean they stay in a coastal or port communities. They go across the country. People in landlocked Alberta or Saskatchewan are getting them from somewhere. These are things that I think now people are connecting the dots a little bit more about. So, again, in terms of the storytelling aspect of this, if you're talking about, the importance of communicating, what's going on in your industry, port security, port policing, what happens at the ports, safeguards around what's going on to those vessels and what's on the manifests versus what's actually on the vessels. I think we are into, in the short to medium term, as much as the environmental and climate related concerns, which remain foremost and primary. I mean, look at that number around potential spills from oil tankers, ships dumping waste and garbage. The cruise ship industry has been really under the microscope around that question for a while, and of course, that's all part of the ecosystem. But really, the awareness on aspects of how, again, the shipping industry is not just connected to our economies, but our communities and the social welfare and the social well-being of our communities is something that I think, although it's not right at the top, when you've got, 2 in 5 or almost half of people identifying that as an impact, that means they're fairly engaged and dialed into that part of the conversation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You've both mentioned elections coming up. I know we've got one in BC, but there's several other provinces with elections, and obviously we're looking ahead to a potential federal election. I thought it might be interesting to turn our attention to what the survey can tell us about at least the governments and regulators more generally, and how they're doing. And so one of the data points that jumped out at me, I think, is the confidence in the overall safety, the rules and regulations covering marine shipping in Canadian waters year by year. So starting back in 2016, we've been asking this question. And I think you could conclude from this that there's a growing confidence in the rules and regulations over time, and that perhaps Canadians think that government and the regulatory bodies like pilotage authorities and ports and harbour authorities are doing a good job. Is that a fair conclusion?
I think it's around what Canadians don't see or what they're not thinking of. And in this case, that is a bit of a good news story. Think back to 2016 and the conversations around pipelines and shipping, shipping oil and shipping gas and the impacts again on the waters right off of our ports. And at that time, there was a significant amount of concern about pipelines being completed, a sevenfold increase in tanker traffic. There's a window right there that overlooks English Bay, and I can actually see way more tankers than I did even a year ago. But at the same time, and touch wood, what we haven't seen are those spills. What we haven't seen are the environmental accidents and disasters that would predicate serious concern about safety rules and regulations.
Mm-hmm.
So, is this an answer that's predicated on respondents really having a very deep and solid depth of knowledge around what those rules and regulations are, who's responsible at the provincial level, who's responsible at the federal level, where does the Coast Guard or the Port Authority come into play? No, but it is certainly, I think, an aspect of the fact that, let's not jinx anything. So far, so good in terms of not seeing the environmental disasters that they were quite concerned about and seized with the better part of a decade ago.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've got in here the breakdown on by kind of you mentioned Coast Guard, different departments. So let's look at that a bit. So this table shows who thinks these organizations are doing a good job or a very good job, and what percentage. So going back to 2016, so we've divided out the Canadian Coast Guard, Canada's Ports and Harbour Authorities, the shipping industry in general, provincial or territorial governments, then specific federal departments as opposed to the federal government overall, and then the International Maritime Organization. So I think you can see Canadian Coast Guard continues to get top marks in terms of people thinking that they do a good job. Interestingly, I don't know whether the federal government or the departments is kind of like an opinion poll on the government in general.
It is a little bit, yeah.
But interestingly, also a decline in kind of confidence in the International Maritime Organization. We see a lot of commentary on our social media feed, when we talk about United Nations and the International Maritime Organization, somewhat skepticism about these international bodies. Is that something you see in other polling? Is this a more general trend, or is this something we can think about specifically to shipping?
John, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, I think you can probably say that a little bit, because we have seen kind of a decline in kind of support and appreciation for kind of these international organizations over the years. And I think the other thing too is that there is a really high don't know, can't say around specifically the International Maritime Organization. For the other departments and the other things that we've asked people to assess, it's about 1 in 5 to 1/4 that say they don't know enough to say to kind of say whether or not these organizations or departments are doing a good or bad job. The International Maritime Organization, it's about 2 in 5. So that is certainly something where people don't really have kind of a lot of confidence in kind of expressing an opinion. So that probably plays a factor in that as well, or maybe 8 years ago, maybe there's a bit more of a knowledge base on what the International Maritime Organization did.
Yeah, and it's back to what you were saying, Shachi, about the kind of what they don't know doesn't hurt them. I guess if they're unaware of something that's happened, they're probably just happy to let it continue. But also not going to express an opinion saying they're doing a good job.
That's right. And to your point, the focus on the referendum on government, when we talk about federal, the federal government overall or specific federal departments, these are areas where the antipathy towards the central government in this country is one that does cleave along political lines, and we know where Canadians are in terms of their vote intention, for example. It is a bit of, and you see that very much on the table in terms of the decline, or the lack of improvement around some of those measures that we ask about.
Yeah, thanks for that. Let's turn our attention now to looking to the future and careers in the marine industry. We asked this question about folks about whether they have personally ever considered working in the marine sector. Now, we know that the sector faces significant shortages in some critical roles. In fact, this week, Imagine Marine is conducting a conference in Ottawa, really highlighting some of these issues. And so this question perhaps starts to unpack a little bit what's going on here. I think that you'd agree that, you know, the black and the red are people that either never heard anything about these kinds of careers, or if they have heard about them, they're not interested. So a very small percentage of the respondents would consider working in the sector or actually want to work in the sector. John or Shachi, is there anything we can learn from that, and as an industry that we can work on that can help to close that gap?
John, why don't you grab the first part of that response, and if there's anything else, I'll come in. But why don't you start?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we also asked kind of that follow-up question, looking at what comes to mind when you think of a career in the shipping industry. And for a lot of people, it is kind of these long, hard hours, kind of long time away from family. And I think that kind of speaks to that red part of the graph, where they've heard about the industry and they're not really interested in it. And I think, whereas like kind of the I've never heard anything about the industry, that kind of just speaks to the communications kind of about, okay, well, maybe there's more work to be done to kind of get the careers out there in front of people who would maybe be interested in kind of pursuing these jobs. And yeah, I think it is kind of interesting too, that it's not just people on the coast that are thinking about, I want to work in this sector, I would consider working in this sector. There are people kind of in the landlocked middle of the country that are like, yeah, that's a job that I would consider taking. So I think there is kind of an interesting subsect of this population where it's like, okay, well, if there was training centers near me, if I could kind of retrain my skills and get a job in the shipping industry, I would consider it, even though I live in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. Yeah, and I really look at those significantly high numbers of people who say they've never heard anything about working in the sector. And to me, that is just a massive opportunity for the sector to do a far more enthusiastic or aggressive job of telling your stories and communicating the potential benefits for working in the sector. I mean, you've got a massive canvas there. 53% of people in Saskatchewan, 50% of people in Manitoba, about the same number in Alberta, who say, I've never heard anything about this. 2 in 5 in BC. You know, that it's a maritime province.
Yeah.
I'm saying I've never heard anything about this. That does speak to the vast amount of room that the industry has and the sector has to say, okay, well, we've clearly got to up our game around recruitment, around how we're talking to people, or if we're talking to people at the post-secondary level, how we're talking to people in the skills and retraining aspect of things. How do we make this a sector that is exciting for young people? How do we make this a sector that feels accessible to people who are having career transition?
That's great. Yeah, thanks, Shachi. You really laid out the challenge there for hopefully those that are listening that are working on this. I think that's a fantastic opportunity that we can tap into. And I think, John, you mentioned there's some reason to be optimistic too about interest in careers in other parts of the marine industry that's not necessarily involving, you know, sea time and long hours away from family. You know, one of the challenges, I guess, is the huge opportunity created through decarbonization and alternative fuels. I think we looked into the data we have here on some of those opportunities. And I think, you mentioned, Alberta, there are skills associated with chemicals and petroleum, that could now be put to work in thinking about handling of alternative marine fuels. I think here we looked at how confident people were in different alternative fuels. So hydrogen, we've got a lot of discussion about hydrogen, production of green hydrogen, export of green hydrogen, using green hydrogen to make alternative fuels. One of them is ammonia. So there's looking at people's perception of what it would look like if we were going to use ammonia as a fuel or a means to transport green hydrogen. And then you can see, as opposed to kind of the default, which I guess would be the shipping of petroleum products, that's kind of the default. You can see people are probably a little more confident about LNG or hydrogen, somewhat less confident about ammonia, probably because they don't really understand why it is that you'd want to be shipping ammonia around. Anything we can learn from this?
Yeah, I think when I was looking at this, I think ammonia kind of stood out just because I think it is somewhat of a known product for people. Like they maybe would have had experience with it in like a household situation as somewhat more of a dangerous chemical, and that probably does kind of inspire a bit more worry than confidence in kind of shipping that product in international waters. And of course, I think Canadians kind of have a lot more experience with the shipping of petroleum products, things like LNG. The volume is not nearly as high. Hydrogen is kind of mostly theoretical at this point for Canadians. So, but that does kind of at least point to that there is a bit of kind of heading into maybe further development of hydrogen or further development of LNG, that Canadians aren't that are more confident than worried that's going to be a product that we're going to be able to safely ship in Canadian waters.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the sort of the hydrogen industry. We did ask that question about I'll pull up the data for that one. So, given that now there's a lot of discussion about investment in hydrogen production using, Canada's clean electricity resources to create hydrogen from electrolysis. We asked what should Canada prioritize in the use of that green hydrogen. And perhaps not surprisingly, I guess, well, there's a couple of things here. There's a category that says that Canada shouldn't invest in hydrogen at all. That's the red category. And then there's the blue category that says, this hydrogen would be great to export it. We've seen some high profile agreements with Germany, with Japan, as an opportunity to export this commodity to those countries. But then the vast majority, I guess, are saying this hydrogen should be used primarily to decarbonize domestic industries and including shipping. Is that surprising, Shachi, or do you see that in other areas as well?
I mean, it's putting Canada first and Canada's decarbonization emissions reductions needs first isn't necessarily a surprise. I would say that, we are seized with Canadians at an everyday level. How can we make a difference? How can we make a difference within our borders? I think at times it comes back to connecting the dots, which is something that your industry does very well, because you're dealing with the movement of goods and other things from one part of the world to the other. But if we were to ask the Canadians, to what extent are our emissions reductions, our emissions responsible for overall global emissions relative to other countries, et cetera, and the opportunities or the importance of not only decarbonizing our own domestic industries, but also helping other countries with that process. I think people tend to think very much about, I'm doing my recycling, I'm, making sure my organics are going in the organics bin, I'm choosing to take transit more. It's very much that personal choice around their own behaviors, and less so around, okay, but how does this fit in within the larger aspect of things? So from that perspective, I would say it doesn't necessarily surprise me that the propensity or the lean is towards the domestic priority, but you do see a significant number saying, look, there's also a role to export to other countries and to sort of be part of the solution in other parts of the world that are, frankly, emerging economies who, and many of them say, and and I think at times rightly so, we're catching up from an economic development perspective. And in many ways, they're actually leapfrogging because the room for innovation is there, but also the openness to saying, well, look, if you're going to walk your talk, then it's also up to you to help us decarbonize as we figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I suppose you could look at this as an overwhelming endorsement of investment in clean technology. I mean, the fact that more than 80% say that we should invest in green hydrogen production is actually quite startling, given what you said about the pressures about, what we should invest in. Maybe we should be investing in supply chain improvements or in making goods cheaper. I think that's an interesting comment on the way, the trends that we're seeing in society, that people are conscious that this is something we need to tackle.
Of course, it's always a matter of trade-offs, Paul, as you know. And next year, of course, the question that we may ask in our next round will be, okay, on a list of things you want to prioritize, where does this fit? But it definitely indicates an openness, a willingness, and as you say, quite a strong endorsement for heading. This is not a controversial thing.
Yeah, that's exciting. Well, we're running out of time here. Maybe we can start to wrap up. I think let's leave it there. I wonder if there are any questions from those that are online and want to put them in the chat. Feel free to do so. I'm just looking here. Maybe we can use. I think there's some discussion about supply chain issues. I know maybe we can dive into that a little bit. I know when we looked at supply chain, when we did this 2 years ago, I guess we were talking about COVID and kind of awareness of supply chain. I wonder whether, let's see if we can pull up this data here. Let's see. No, I don't think we have it in the pack. Oh no, here we are. Do we believe improvements to Canada's maritime supply chain should be yeah, so this is a question around how should those improvements be funded? So I think we last time we looked at kind of what where should what Canadians have become much more aware about the vulnerabilities of the supply chain with the big supply chain crunch and those sorts of things. Now I think in this survey we asked a new question around okay, given that we believe that there's some improvements should be made to the robustness and to the free flowing of goods, how should that be funded? And I think it's kind of interesting because there's the traditional approaches of saying funding it at the government's and taxpayers' expense is not particularly popular. Funding by industry is probably more popular than that. But interestingly here, the most overwhelming solution proposed here was that public and private partnerships should be interesting sharing of costs. Is that significant, or would you expect that typically to be the breakdown?
I look at the top two results on that, Paul, and what I see there is that the vast majority are saying, look, that there is a role for industry here. So whether it's a public-private partnership or whether it's entirely industry, it leans, public sentiment leans very heavily to industry needs to invest in itself.
Right. Okay, I think we're out of time. Let's wrap it up here. I just wanted to say thank you so much to Shachi and to John and the Angus Reid Institute for working with us on this. Great discussion, and I've learned a lot about this, and looking forward to digging into the details of the report and the data tables. You can go onto our website, take a look at clearseas.org. The full report's downloadable. All the data is downloadable. If you want to do your own cuts and analysis and see, it's all available there. And take a look for yourselves. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.